When you think about Renaissance Europe, you probably think about the art, the music, or the alarming amount of diseases. But have you ever thought about the werewolves? Hi, I'm Liz, and welcome to Behind the Folklore, a podcast where I overanalyze mythology and try to figure out what influenced the stories. Today, I'll be talking about how famine, true crime, and the church influenced the French werewolf epidemic that lasted from 1520 to 1630. Before I even get to any of the stories or the history from this epidemic, I want to go into what people thought werewolves looked like or how others could become one. The way to tell someone was a werewolf in their human form are honestly a little bit rude. It was said that if people had eyebrows that met at the bridge of the nose, they had curved fingernails, low-set ears, and a swinging stride, that they probably were a werewolf. While transformed into wolves, they most likely resembled the actual animal, but there were some key differences. Some ways to tell a werewolf apart from a real wolf was to make sure that they had a tail. It was also said that they would keep their human eyes and voice while in wolf form. There were a few ways of detecting a werewolf. Some people believed that if you cut one while they were in their human form, fur could be seen in the wound. People also thought that if someone had just changed back to a human, they would be fatigued, anxious, and depressed. So how did people think others could become a werewolf? Some believed that if you slept outside on a summer's night with a full moon in your face, you could turn into a werewolf that way. But it was only possible if someone did this on a Wednesday or a Friday. I don't know why those specific days, but hey, whatever. The most common belief was that a person made a pact with the devil, because of course it was. In some cases, everyone believed that the person was a sorcerer and would gain their abilities by making a girdle. From what I can find, I guess that's some kind of belt. They also thought they could make a salve or an ointment with the instinct of the devil. There was no clarification what that meant, so your guess is as good as mine. So obviously, from all the details and the thoughts behind werewolves and how you could tell someone was one or how you became one, these people were really superstitious. But I don't think superstition alone is the cause for the werewolf epidemic in France. I mean, 30,000 people were accused and it lasted for over a century, so what else went into this just hysteria? During this time, gray wolves, or timber wolves as they're also known, were all across Europe. Now they could range anywhere from 70 to 130 pounds in weight and measure 40 to 65 inches in length. For anyone who uses the metric system, that is 31.75 to 58.97 kilograms and 101.6 to 165.1 centimeters. They have shorter and denser fur compared to the wolves here in America, and despite their name, they can be white, cream, red, gray, and black in color. Sometimes they can even be a combination of some or all of these colors. Gray wolves typically travel in packs that number anywhere from 6 to 10, although those numbers can be a little higher. And while they look big and scary, I personally think they're very cute, but they do avoid people and they rarely attack livestock. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't happen, because of course it does, but it's still really rare. Now, in those odd occasions where they do attack people, it's usually attributed to rabies, as it would be with really any wild animal. Now, when it's not caused by rabies, most likely the wolf is feeling trapped or threatened, or maybe doesn't even have access to its natural food sources. But what would cause a wolf to miss out on its natural food resources? I mean, they feed on things like deer or rabbits or just smaller animals. Famines would probably do that. And France had no shortage of those during the 16th and 17th centuries. During this time, Western Europe was hit by numerous wars, epidemics, and famines. And while I couldn't find much information on these specific famines, I was able to find a table on Wikipedia that laid out the years and regions that were affected. In 1528, Languedoc, forgive me if I said that wrong, I probably did, a former province in southern France was hit by famine. Multiple pan-European famines that included France hit off and on during the period from 1569 to 1598. The last famine to hit France during the werewolf epidemic was in 1630 and lasted until 1631. The source where I found the information, which was really just the years, honestly, was pretty vague, but it did make it sound like that famine was one of the worst ones. So clearly, the wolves' food sources were missing out on some of their food sources, so that could lead to more wolf attacks on people. So I don't think it's unreasonable that, unfortunately, some of the everyday field workers in France, everyday people, saw someone be attacked by a wolf. But do I think all 30,000 accusations were able to be blamed on wolves? No, that's just really unreasonable. Now, before I go on to what I do think attributed to some of the horror stories from this time period, I want to make a disclaimer that I will be touching on some true crime, which is just never a good time. It's always very sad, even if it's so long ago and the people are nameless when it comes to the victims. I would also like to mention that it will mention the murder of children and some cannibalism. Towards the beginning of the accusations, there was a team that was causing a panic in Pologne, and they were finally caught. In December of 1521, Pierre Bergot and Michel Verdun were charged with witchcraft and cannibalism. Bergot made some confessions that shocked and horrified the community partway through the trial. According to his testimony, Bergot claimed that 19 years prior, his herd of sheep were scattered by a storm. While he was out searching for them, he ran into 3 horsemen, and they asked him what was going on. So Bergot told them. One of the men promised him 3 things that seemed too good to be true. First, Bergot would find his sheep. Second, he would never run into any trouble again. And third, he would gain money. Which all sounds great, but, what's the catch? He agreed to meet the men because the man who told him these promises said they would only happen if he would serve his master. So after this little meeting, Bergot goes on his way, and of course he finds a sheep, or else the story wouldn't have happened. So he decides he's going to go to this meeting after all, and when he goes, he finds out that the man served the devil. So Bergot agreed, and he would also serve the devil and renounce his Christian faith. Now, after that, some time passed, and Bergot became a little bit complacent with this service to Satan. So 2 years after, he started to return to church because he got really bored. It was during this time that he was approached by Verdun, and Verdun managed to convince Bergot that he needed to return to the devil and begin serving him again. And he made the promise that if he did so, Bergot would gain some massive wealth. So, of course, he agreed again, and they went into the woods, and allegedly the 2 transformed into werewolves. According to Bergot, whenever it happened, they had used a salve to do so, and he was alarmed when he looked down and saw his wolf feet. Now, they were rubbed with the salve again to become human, and unlike others who would later confess, Bergot claimed that he felt no fatigue or paranoia when he turned back into a man. Now, before they were arrested, the pair claimed to have attacked and killed 6 people and a goat. The first was a small boy who was either 5 or 6 years old. Bergot had intended to tear him apart, but thankfully the boy was able to alarm nearby people, which caused Bergot to run away. Bergot later claimed that he turned back into a human by using the salve again, which we had mentioned just a little bit ago. And sadly, the next victim was not as lucky as this little boy. Next, a woman was gathering peas when she was attacked by Bergot and Verdun. This time, they did succeed in murdering this poor lady. Along with the woman, a man who had come to help her when he heard the attack was also murdered. Next was a 4-year-old girl who was murdered and cannibalized by the pair. Only her arm was left, and after that, an unknown girl was murdered as well. The final attack was on a 9-year-old girl who Bergot killed by breaking her neck while she was weeding her family's garden. And sadly, Verdun corroborated all of Burgos' statements. Our next quote-unquote werewolf is the Werewolf of Dole, named Giles Garnier. This name sounded a little familiar to me, and I realized that I had actually heard about him on a podcast before where they covered some medieval crimes. Garnier was described as a hermit who lived in the woods outside of Dole. He lived there on his own, and I assume he fed himself well because he was able to stay alive long enough to find a wife, despite isolating himself from the community. After Garnier brought his new bride home, it seems that he started to have a hard time providing for more than himself. It wasn't long after that some local children started to go missing, and sometimes they were found deceased. The disappearances prompted local leaders to issue an edict where the townspeople were encouraged to capture and kill the werewolf. And I couldn't help but notice that they immediately jumped to blaming a werewolf instead of a person for these horrible, horrible crimes. Eventually, some hunters did stumble upon the body of a child being picked at by what they thought was a werewolf at first, but once they looked closer, they realized that it was actually Garnier who was there. Obviously, he was promptly arrested. Now, during the interrogation, Garnier claimed that he ran into a mysterious figure while he was out trying to hunt for his new family. This weird person offered him an ointment and promised that it would make his hunt easier by turning him into a werewolf. I do appreciate the man's honesty, but, he probably shouldn't have offered it if this is true. After that, he started stalking and hunting children between the ages of 9 and 12 from 1572 to 1573. I won't go into details because they are very upsetting, but Garnier would kill the children and cannibalize parts of them on the spot before bringing more home to his wife. In 1574, due to his confessions and witness testimonies, Garnier was found guilty of witchcraft and lycanthropy, and he was burned at the stake for his crimes. Another accused werewolf that I was able to find while researching was named Jacques Roulet. Jacques was a man who lived in poverty, and he was able to find lodgings due to the charity of his neighbors. He was discovered days after disappearing from the last home someone allowed him to stay in by two hunters after they chased two wolves away from the body of a 15-year-old boy. When they found him, Roulet was covered in tattered clothes with blood-soaked hands. There was flesh under his nails. Of course, just like with Garnier, Roulet was dragged into custody when he was found in this state. He was interrogated and most likely tortured, as was standard for the time, but he did end up confessing to being a werewolf. According to Roulet, his parents gave him a salve that gave him these powers, but the locals took this with a grain of salt as his parents were respected in the community, and he didn't stop accusing family with his parents. He also claimed that his brother Jean and cousin Julien were werewolves as well. The three of them would allegedly go hunting for women and children. Now, initially, Roulet was sentenced to death for his crimes, but surprisingly, the sentence was commuted to 2 years in an asylum, and he had to take lessons about Christian theology. The reasoning behind this change was that officials believed the man to be mentally ill due to his poverty. That was the only reasoning I found, so cool. They were aware of mental health, kind of, but the reasoning wasn't great. Now, since this, case, I was not able to find any other information or accusations against Roulet. So I do hope that for people's sake, he did receive the help that he needed. And from what I was able to tell, that does seem to be the case. The final case that I will be talking about, the killer's name has been lost, but he does have a couple of pseudonyms. The first, which goes along with what we are talking about, is the Werewolf of Chalon. And the second name while fitting really makes me think of a bootleg version of Sweeney Todd, he was also known as the demonic tailor. Of course, in a second, the origins of the second name will become clear. In 1598, during the time that Roulet was killing women and children, there were children going missing at an alarming rate in Chalon. Sightings of a half-man, half-beast creature were also starting to be reported during this time. Of course, the locals, started to associate both anomalies. The association, and of course the fear that goes along with it, rose as reports began to say that a beast was spotted devouring the bodies of the children. This was supported when the children who were able to survive the encounters told of a werewolf that chased them through the woods. Consequently, a group of people formed a hunting party for the monster, but they were unsuccessful. It wasn't long before suspicions began to fall on the local tailor. The local people claimed that they heard cries and other troubling sounds coming from his shop, and they also noted that the tailor had an unnatural interest in the children that would pass by his store. Eventually, some claimed that they even saw the man running into the woods at all hours of the night. Due to the growing suspicion around the tailor, his shop was eventually searched, and I can only imagine the nightmares people had after seeing what they did. There were barrels in a room that were filled with the bones of children. Another room resembled more of a butcher's shop instead of a tailor's. There was meat that was suspected to be human found, some of it half-eaten. The backyard was also covered in shallow graves. Now, despite the tailor staying calm and denying that he had been hurting the children, people weren't buying it, so they arrested him and he was immediately interrogated. He eventually admitted to murdering somewhere around 50 local children, but he was adamant that he was not a werewolf. His denial, of course, didn't sway the public opinion. They already had their minds set. It was rumored that he would fly into fits of rage during his questioning and would foam at the mouth and display unnatural strength. His case, of course, moved on to trial, where people were sitting because they wanted to watch. What else did they have to do? And they also claimed that he would turn into a werewolf in the courtroom. The man was sentenced to death, as was protocol, and at his execution, witnesses claimed that he transformed once again, but they did manage to carry out his sentence. The disappearances thankfully stopped after the man's death, and it's said that the courts destroyed the records in an effort to erase the case from history. So I will admit, I don't think this is the most reliable story, but I was able to find it, and so I'm going to use it. Alright, so now that all of the heavy topics are out of the way, thankfully, I will be moving on to the methods that most of these stories claimed turned them into werewolves. As I'm sure you've noticed, almost all of the stories involved a salve or ointment of some kind that was associated with granting the person lycanthropy. As I said before, this was believed to be one of the ways someone could turn into a werewolf and was associated with the devil, but why was there so much suspicion around just topical treatments? Now, what I'm about to say is just purely my own speculation, but I believe in a super Christian area like Renaissance France, this hatred for ointments stems from a fear of paganism. Herbal medicine is often associated with folk medicine. Now, for me personally, when I think of folk medicine, I think of things like Appalachian home remedies and, other such related medicines. But that obviously didn't exist in medieval and Renaissance Europe. So, for the people of the time and place, it would most likely be equated to pre-Christian beliefs, which would be pagan beliefs. Now, while the church did eventually turn to some forms of herbal medication, they often used hoping in miracles and divine intervention to cure a person. This makes sense, as such a thing would make the cured believe in the church even more than they had prior to their recovery. Even when medical herbal medicine was accepted, I'm really doubtful that the clergy would want just anybody to be able to treat others with it. That would mean that the sick would be able to have options other than church-controlled medical resources. Now, while we think of the Vatican and Italy, we think that is the epitome of European Christianity, but France was also very involved. We can't forget at one point during the bubonic plague in the 1340s, France did have an unapproved second pope. So I do think there's very much a motivation for the French clergy to dissuade people from turning to folk remedies. So with everything covered, what do I think caused the French werewolf epidemic? I do think that people did witness a handful of attacks from real, actual wolves when they faced a lack of natural resources. And while it's rare, wolf attacks are not impossible, as we covered before, when they are facing times of, starvation. But it is still reasonable that someone would think wolves are an immediate threat. Now, due to people being more superstitious in those times, the serial killers, as I mentioned before, were probably credited to monsters rather than just horrible people. I mean, obviously, serial killers leave behind horrific scenes, and most people could only picture a monster doing that, especially in a time where they had no concept of serial killers. Since the people did have the exposure to the wolf attacks, I just think France's sights turned to werewolves instead of witches like their neighboring countries to justify these horrific crimes. I also think that the church's influence led to people thinking that the only way people could become such monsters was due to the devil corrupting them. I mean, after all, who would really want to believe that just a regular human person could be capable of doing such things on their own accord? Thank you all so much for listening to this first episode of Behind the Folklore. Next week, I will be covering the ancient Scandinavian zombie known as the Draugr. In the meantime, feel free to leave your own theories on werewolves and have an amazing week.